The first time the door locked on its own, I assumed it was just old hardware. Houses settle, wood warps, and things shift. It was an old house, after all, older than I initially thought when I signed the lease. I had been searching for a new place for months, something secluded, away from the chaos of city life. A house that offered solitude, where I could focus on my work without the constant hum of traffic and noise creeping through my walls. When I found the house, it seemed too good to be true. The rent was cheap, absurdly so. A 2-story Victorian-style home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood at the edge of town, surrounded by tall, gnarled oak trees that blocked most of the sunlight during the day. The landlady, Mrs. Holloway, was an elderly woman who barely spoke during our initial meeting. She just handed me the keys with shaking hands, her thin fingers cold and dry as paper. "You sure about this one?" she asked, staring past me at the house. "It's perfect," I said, feeling victorious at the steal of a deal. She hesitated. The last tenant didn't stay long. "Why not?" She pursed her lips, hesitating again before saying, "Some people don't like old houses." That should have been my first clue. But at the time, I was more concerned with getting settled in. The first few days went smoothly. I set up my workspace in the upstairs study, unpacked my things, and stocked the fridge with enough food to last me a week. The house had a strange silence to it, the kind that felt heavier at night, but I chalked it up to being alone in a new space. Then the door locked itself. It happened late at night, while I was in the kitchen making tea. I had left my bedroom door open, I was certain of it, but when I walked back upstairs, I found it shut. Worse, when I turned the knob, it wouldn't budge. My stomach tightened. I checked my pockets. The key was still downstairs, but the door had never needed a key before. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe the old lock mechanism had slipped. Maybe a draft had caused it to shut. But the air in the hallway was perfectly still. I knocked on the door, half expecting to hear movement from the other side. Of course, there was nothing, just silence. I ran downstairs, grabbed the key, and twisted it into the lock. It resisted for a moment before clicking open, the door swinging inward as if it had never been locked at all. I stood there, staring into my empty bedroom, my heart pounding in my ears. That was the first night I struggled to sleep. Over the next few days, the door continued to lock itself at random times. I tested the knob during the day, turning it over and over, trying to recreate whatever was happening at night. It never jammed, never resisted. But at night, when I wasn't looking, when I let my guard down, it would be locked again. I told myself it was the house settling. That's what old houses do, right? They shift, they move, they breathe. But then the scratching started. At first, I thought it was mice in the walls. Soft, rhythmic sounds that came from inside the door itself. I pressed my ear against it one night, holding my breath, and felt something cold trickle down my spine when I realized the scratching wasn't coming from inside the walls. It was coming from inside my room. I stepped back, my pulse hammering, waiting for another sound. Then a long, deliberate scrape ran down the wood, slow and steady. I turned the knob, locked. "Hello," I called, feeling stupid for speaking into an empty house. Silence. I ran downstairs again, grabbing the key with shaking hands. By the time I got back, the door was slightly ajar. I froze. I left it open? No, I remember distinctly it was locked. I took a cautious step forward and nudged the door open the rest of the way. Nothing. The room was exactly as I had left it, except for one small detail. On the inside of the door, 5 long scratches ran from the top to the bottom, as if something or someone had been clawing at it from within. I convinced myself I was sleepwalking. That had to be the answer, right? Stress, exhaustion, a new environment, it made sense. Maybe I had scratched the door myself in my sleep, even though my nails were too short to make such deep marks. I ignored the fear gnawing at me and carried on with my work, trying to focus on deadlines instead of the creeping sense of unease in my own home. But things got worse. The next few nights, I started waking up at exactly 3:14 a.m. every night. No matter what time I went to bed, my eyes would snap open at that exact minute, my heart racing for no reason. Then I started seeing them, the shadows. It began subtly, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, a dark shape where there shouldn't be one. But soon, they became more defined. One night, I was brushing my teeth when I saw something in the bathroom mirror, a figure standing in the hallway behind me. Tall, motionless. I spun around. Nothing. But the moment I turned back to the mirror, it was closer. By the end of the week, I was losing sleep. I kept every light on in the house, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. I refused to look at the mirror, refused to acknowledge the scratches multiplying on the inside of my door. But then something changed. The night before I decided to leave, I heard it for the first time. A whisper, faint, close, right next to my ear. Let me in. I bolted upright in bed, my skin crawling. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't dreaming. The door was locked again, and the scratching had started once more. I didn't sleep that night. The whisper had been real. I knew it had been. Let me in. The words played over and over in my mind, seeping into every corner of my thoughts. My body refused to move for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the headboard, my eyes fixed on the locked door. The scratching had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. A kind of silence that listens. I told myself to breathe, that I had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind or some auditory hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation. But as I sat there, shrouded in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, something shifted in the air. A pressure, subtle at first, then heavier. The kind of weight that makes your skin prickle, that presses against your lungs like unseen hands. Something was there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The same way you feel someone standing behind you in a dark room, even if they never make a sound. And then the doorknob rattled. I sucked in a sharp breath, my fingers gripping the sheets so tightly they ached. The knob twisted, turned not from my side, from the inside. The breath caught in my throat as a slow, deliberate pressure pushed against the locked door. A testing kind of push like someone or something was seeing if they could get out. I bolted. Jumping out of bed, I scrambled for the key on my desk. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it twice. My heartbeat was deafening in my ears as I shoved the key into the lock and turned it. The moment the lock clicked open, the pressure vanished. The air returned to normal. I hesitated before pushing the door open, my stomach knotting with dread. But the second I did, I knew something had changed. Everything looked the same at first glance. My bed, my desk, my open suitcase on the floor. But then I noticed something, the scratches. They were deeper now, and there were more of them. The once faint claw marks had grown, crisscrossing the wood in jagged, erratic patterns, reaching all the way to the bottom of the door, as if something had been crawling out. I swallowed hard, scanning the room for anything else out of place. Then I saw them, the footprints, Dark, wet prints on the wooden floor. Not shoe prints. Bare feet. They started from inside the room, trailing toward the door, as if something had been standing there right before I unlocked it. I couldn't move. My skin went ice cold. I was alone, or at least I had been. The next few days, I avoided my room as much as possible. I slept downstairs on the couch, though slept was a strong word. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. It didn't matter if I kept the lights on, it was always there. By the third night, exhaustion won. My body finally caved, dragging me into a heavy, dreamless sleep. But then, sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up, and I couldn't move. I knew what was happening. Sleep paralysis, I had read about it before. Your mind wakes up, but your body lags behind, leaving you trapped between consciousness and dreaming. But this wasn't just sleep paralysis. Something was in the room with me. I couldn't turn my head, but I could see it from the corner of my vision. A dark figure standing at the foot of the couch. Tall. Wrong. Its arms were too long, its fingers twitching slightly at its sides. No face, at least none that I could see. And then it moved. Slow, deliberate steps, closer and closer, until it was standing right beside me. Then it did something worse than anything else. It bent down, leaned so close I could feel the air shift beside my ear. And then, in a voice that didn't belong in this world, it whispered, "You should have never opened the door." I gasped. My body jerked awake, and suddenly I was sitting up, my chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. The room was empty, but the couch beneath me was ice cold, as if something had been sitting there the whole time. I knew I needed to leave. This wasn't just a creaky old house with faulty locks. This was something else, something I didn't understand. But I was stubborn. I convinced myself I had imagined it all: sleep paralysis, stress, the power of suggestion. I even called a locksmith, pretending I just wanted to replace the door hardware. The guy who came out was in his late 50s, smelled like cigarettes, and looked like he had seen some things. I stood awkwardly behind him as he inspected the bedroom door. "Strange," he muttered, running his fingers over the scratches. "You sure this wasn't a dog or something?" "I don't have a dog," I said. He grunted. "Could have been rats in the walls." I wanted to laugh. Rats didn't scratch doors like that. Then, as he worked on the lock, he suddenly stopped. His face twisted into something unreadable. "Where'd you get this door?" "What?" I frowned. "It was here when I moved in." He gave me a sharp look. "You sure? Looks older than the rest of the house. Hardware's outdated, real outdated. Like, not from this century outdated." A chill ran through me. "What does that mean?" He hesitated. Finally, he shook his head. "Nothing. Just weird is all." But the way he rushed to finish his work, the way he wouldn't look me in the eye, it told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just an old door. It had a history, and it wanted out. That night, I decided. I was leaving. I packed my bags, called my landlord, told her something had come up and I'd be out by morning. I didn't care about getting my deposit back. I just needed out. I fell asleep on the couch again, too drained to fight exhaustion. Then, 3:14 a.m., I woke up. The air was heavy, too heavy. And then, from upstairs, a loud, booming knock. I stopped breathing. Another knock. Louder. Harder. Bang. 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 Something was beating on the locked bedroom door. I sat up, my entire body frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, the doorknob upstairs started turning. Click, click, click. Slowly, deliberately. Then, in that same voice, low, inhuman. Inches from my ear, don't go. The light flickered, and the door at the top of the stairs slammed open. The door at the top of the stairs slammed open, and the house fell into a suffocating silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. For a long time, I just sat there, staring up the staircase, my hands clenched so tightly around the blanket that my knuckles ached. The bedroom door was open. I should have run. I should have left right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I stood up, legs trembling, heart hammering, and took one slow step toward the stairs. Then another. Then another. The silence pressed against my ears like a living thing, thick and waiting. And then, just as I reached the first step, a whisper from upstairs. Come back inside. I stopped cold. My breath hitched. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was soft, coaxing, like something trying to lure me back in. I swallowed the scream, threatening to claw its way out of my throat, and took a slow, shuddering step backward. The air in the house shifted, a pulse of something cold. Then the sound of footsteps, coming from my bedroom, coming toward the stairs. I turned and ran. I grabbed my keys, yanked open the front door, and stumbled out onto the porch. My breath hit the night air like fog, my chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. The house loomed behind me, its dark windows watching. Nothing followed me. Nothing chased me. But I still felt it, standing just beyond the threshold, waiting. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that they hurt. I was leaving. I had to. But then I hesitated. It wasn't just fear that made me hesitate. It was rage. I refused to let something that shouldn't even exist force me out of my own home. What was it? What did it want? I wasn't a skeptic anymore, not after everything I'd seen. But that didn't mean I could just run. Not yet. So I made a mistake. I decided to stay. The next morning, I went straight to the library. If the locksmith was right, if the door was older than the rest of the house, then maybe, just maybe, there was something in the records. Something that would explain why this was happening. It took hours of digging. Old property records, faded newspaper clippings, anything I could find. And then, buried in an article from 1907, I found it. A house once stood on this land before mine. A house that had burned to the ground in mystery. A family had lived here, James and Margaret Holloway, along with their young daughter, Annabelle. The article described the fire as unusual. No known cause. No evidence of how it started. But the strangest part? They never found Annabelle's body. Only the parents. Burned, unrecognizable. Annabelle had vanished. The only thing left untouched by the fire? Her bedroom door. I slammed the book shut, my stomach twisting into a knot. My bedroom, the room with the scratch door, the one that locked on its own. Had it belonged to Annabelle? Was that why the door was different? Had they taken it from the ruins and rebuilt around it? A sick feeling coiled in my gut. If the door had survived the fire, had something else survived with it? I needed proof. I wasn't leaving without proof. That night, I set up my phone on a tripod in the hallway, facing the bedroom door. If something was there, if anything was moving that door, I would catch it. I left the room locked, turned off all the lights, and went downstairs to wait. At exactly 3 a.m., I heard it. A faint, slow creaking from upstairs. Then a click, the lock turning on its own. I grabbed my phone and rushed to the stairs. The door was open, wide open. I swallowed hard, a tremor running down my spine. Whatever was inside wanted me to know it could come out whenever it wanted. Hands shaking, I pressed play on the recording. The video started normal, just the closed, locked door. Then at 2:58 a.m., something changed. A shadow moved onto the door. A dark, humanoid shape, shifting, stretching unnaturally against the floor. Then the doorknob twisted. Slow, patient. I could hear the click of the lock disengaging, but the part that froze my blood, the whisper caught on the audio. Faint, distant. Let me out. My stomach dropped. Then the door swung open on its own. And for a split second, just one, there was something standing in the doorway. A girl. Or, at least, it looked like a girl. But her face was wrong. Blurry. Indistinct. And her eyes, too black. Too deep. Like there was something else behind them, looking through her. Then, she vanished. The video ended. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The only thing I knew, for sure, I was leaving. Tonight. I didn't even pack. I just grabbed my car keys, stuffed my wallet into my pocket, and booked a hotel room online. I would be gone before midnight. But just as I was about to walk out the front door, slam, every door in the house shut at once. A blast of cold air rushed through the room, rattling the windows. Then, footsteps upstairs. Heavy, running, straight toward the stairs. I turned and bolted. I didn't care if I left the door open, didn't care if I dropped my phone in the driveway. I just ran. I didn't stop until I was behind the wheel, the engine roaring to life. The house stood there, dark and still, waiting. As I peeled out of the driveway, tires screeching against the pavement, I saw at the upstairs window. Something was watching me. A figure. Small. Still. And just before I turned the corner, before I left that house behind forever, I swear to God, the door upstairs slowly swung shut. I thought I was free, driving away from that house, my heart hammering. I swore I would never set foot in it again. The weight pressing on my chest, the constant feeling of being watched, lifted the farther I got. By the time I reached the motel, I almost felt normal again. But that night, I realized something horrifying. I had taken it with me. I barely slept that first night at the motel. My body twitched at every sound, my mind replaying the footage over and over. That thing in the video, that shadow, standing in the doorway, whispering, "Let me out," I couldn't get out of my head. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, scratching. Right outside my motel door. I jolted awake, my body paralyzed in fear. Soft, deliberate scratches against the wood, like something was testing it. My breath hitched. Then a click, the sound of the lock turning. I shot up, heart pounding so hard it made my ribs ache. But the door was still locked. I scrambled for my phone, hands shaking as I flipped on the flashlight. Slowly, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing, just an empty hallway. But my gut told me the truth. It had been there. It had followed me. I packed my things that morning and drove straight to a friend's house, someone I trusted, someone who wouldn't ask questions. Connor. We'd been friends since college, and he didn't hesitate to let me crash at his place. "Dude, you look like hell," he said as I dropped my bag inside. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" "Not exactly." I couldn't explain it. If I told him, he'd think I was insane. But it didn't matter, because that night, it happened again. I was lying awake in Connor's guest room, staring at the ceiling when my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "Are you home?" A cold chill crawled up my spine. My fingers hesitated over the screen before I typed back. "Who is this?" The reply came instantly. "You left the door open." My stomach dropped. I sat up, my breathing ragged, staring at the screen. My fingers trembled as I typed. What door? 3 dots appeared. Then come back. I dropped the phone. My pulse pounded in my ears. And then the phone rang. I stare at the screen, throat tight. No caller ID. I hesitated. Then, with shaking hands, I answered. For a long moment, there was silence. Then a whisper, a voice that wasn't human. You can't leave me behind. My breath hitched. Then the call ended. I should have told Connor. I should have packed my things and left that night. But I didn't. And the next morning, something wasn't right. Connor looked exhausted. Dude, he said, rubbing his temples. I had the weirdest dream last night. A chill ran through me. What kind of dream? He hesitated. I was standing in the hallway, outside the guest room. It was dark, but I could see the door. It was opening on its own. But I knew you were asleep. And there was this. He trailed off, his eyes unfocused. This what? I pressed. Connor swallowed. A little girl, he said finally, standing inside. She was staring at me. My stomach dropped. I couldn't move. I just stood there. And then she smiled at me. A cold wave of dread washed over me. And then I whispered. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup. And then she whispered something. I waited, barely breathing. Connor looked up at me, his face pale. She said, "He's mine." The word sent a shock wave through my body. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was spreading. It was trying to claim me. I couldn't keep running. I knew deep down that I had to go back. I had to end it, whatever it was. I drove back to the house that evening, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The house stood there, dark and waiting. As I stepped onto the porch, the air felt different, heavy. The second I crossed the threshold, my stomach turned to ice. Something had changed. The house knew I was back, and it was ready. I took slow, cautious steps up the stairs, my breath shallow. And when I reached my bedroom door, I froze. The door was already open. I stepped inside. The air smelled burnt, like old fire, like something that had been ash and smoke, but never quite faded. The walls were the same. The furniture was the same. But I wasn't alone. I knew that the second I stepped in. The closet door was slightly ajar. I stared at it, my heart pounding. A slow creak echoed through the room. The closet door was opening, and then a voice, soft, childlike. You left me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then the figure stepped out. A little girl, or at least it looked like one. Dark hair, pale skin, a tattered nightgown burned at the edges. Her eyes hollow, black, endless. I took a step back, my entire body locked in terror. She took a step forward. You left me. The room shifted, the air turning thick like smoke. I tried to run, but the door slammed shut. And I heard it, the lock turning on its own. I slammed into the door, shaking the handle violently, but it wouldn't budge. The lock had turned on its own, sealing me inside with her. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear her, soft bare feet padding across the floor. A whispering hiss that sounded like air escaping from a cracked window. You left me. Her voice was closer, too close. I turned my head just slightly, enough to see her from the corner of my eye. She was standing right behind me. Her skin was cracked, like porcelain splitting apart, and her black, hollow eyes bored into me with something not quite human. I grabbed the door handle, twisting, yanking, pounding my fist against the wood. Let me out, I screamed. And then her hand brushed my arm. A sensation like ice sinking into my bones spread through me. A vision rushed into my head, flames, a house burning, a child screaming. Her, her face twisted in agony, watching through a window as fire swallowed everything. Then darkness. I gasped as I came back to the present, stumbling away from her. She didn't move. She just watched. And that's when I understood. The house had burned before. A fire, years ago. And she had been trapped inside. Her spirit never left. And now, she was trapped again. And she wanted me to stay with her. You don't have to do this, I whispered, my voice shaking. Her blackened fingers twitched. You left me, she repeated. But this time, I heard something else beneath the words. A plea, a longing. She wasn't just angry. She was lonely. She was stuck, just like I was. I took a slow breath. I had to break the pattern. If she had died in the fire, if she had been locked inside, then maybe the way to free her was to open the door. I turned back to the lock, my heart thundering in my chest. My fingers were ice cold as I touched the knob again. But this time I didn't yank at it. Instead, I turned it slowly. You're not alone anymore, I whispered. Behind me, she stopped moving. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a click. The lock unlatched itself. The door swung open, and behind me, the air shifted. The burning smell faded. The feeling of cold hands on my skin vanished. I turned back. She was gone. The room was empty. I stepped out, and the door didn't lock behind me. I left the house that night, for good. But before I did, I checked the property records, and I found it. A fire. 1926, a little girl trapped inside. The house had been rebuilt, but her spirit never left. She had been waiting for someone to open the door. And now, I think she was finally free. But still, some nights when I'm alone, I swear I can hear it. The sound of a lock turning on its own. A whisper just behind me. You left me.